Good morning and welcome. We come together this morning once again to look at God's Word and continue studying those things that He has said, those things that He wants us to know and to apply to our lives. This morning we're going to look at Matthew chapter 14, continuing on from the previous story. So we'll read verse 22 through to the end of verse 32. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up into the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, and the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." And may God bless us as we continue to look at his word this morning. God has recorded many things in his word. And while he has not recorded everything, that which he has chosen to record has a purpose. He wants to tell us something that we might learn and understand who he is and the other things he needs us to know. Well, many of the accounts that we first heard, we heard as children: Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Noah's Ark and the flood, Moses and the Ten Commandments, Jonah and the whale, Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Nebuchadnezzar, David and Goliath, Daniel in the lion's den, Joseph and his coat of many colors. And there are so many other great records that God put into his word for us. Being raised as a Roman Catholic, I do not recall there being a Sunday school. I attended a Catholic school until grade 4 or 5, but I do not remember being taught anything biblical in school other than the classes that pertain to confession, communion, and confirmation. And even then, I don't remember the lessons. So I'm not sure how much of the Bible was included. Much of what I do remember learning came from my own interest in reading the accounts from our family Bible. At a very young age, I just looked at the depictions of the accounts as recreated by renowned artists. I had no idea what the actual story was, but they interested me. I wanted to know. Now, I'm not sure at what age I became able to read the words that were there under the pictures, or how to look up the actual accounts in the Bible, but somehow I learned along the way and I came to know the truth. Now, I remember reading the Gospels before I was 9, and I discovered that there were events I'd been led to believe were biblical that were missing from my Bible. And whereas I'd been taught that Jesus fell 3 times on the way to the cross, and that a woman by the name of Veronica had wiped Jesus' face and his image had remained on her cloth, neither of those stories is found in the Gospels. So I asked the priest at school about this discrepancy, and he asked me, who told me I could read the Bible? I was not properly prepared to understand what was written. So I asked another priest, and he told me I was not to take what I read literally. But I do. And this morning's account is one of my favorites, especially when I picture it happening in my mind. So let's begin in Matthew chapter 14, 23b. And evening having arrived, he was there alone. Well, having finally dispersed the crowd of more than 5,000 people and ordered the disciples to cross the Sea of Galilee, Jesus had gone into the mountains to be alone. How did Jesus feel when he was alone? What thoughts occupy his mind? Because I know I can't sit very quietly without thoughts in my head. Did he get any sleep that night? And meanwhile, verse 24, and the boat, being now many stadia from the land, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. The disciples are quite a distance from shore, perhaps 2/3 of the way across, halfway across, but they are caught in this incredible storm. Things had probably started out fine. The sea likely looked okay when the disciples set out, but strong winds funnel in from the Mediterranean Sea through Israel to the Sea of Galilee without warning, and very suddenly, everything can become so treacherous. So the waves were tossing the boat. Literally, that word means it was like it was being examined in a torturous manner, like a giant had plucked it up out of the sea and was rolling it around in his hands to have a good look at it. That's the idea behind that word. And the wind was contrary. If it were a living thing, it was doing its best to stop the disciples from getting to the other side or to safety. Whatever the disciples, and those who were formerly fishermen and they knew how to sail, whatever they might have done to try and correct what was happening, the wind changed what it was doing so that their efforts were futile. They were at the mercy of the elements. All around them, the wind was creating these white-capped waves. It was dark. They couldn't see very well, and they were tired. Now, let me tell you, on the evening of May 14th and into the morning of May 15th in 2022, a similar storm to move across the Sea of Galilee, causing more than $50 million in damages to the surrounding towns. People who live in this area of the Sea of Galilee are used to the winds in the spring, and they refer to them as whistlers. But this storm had sustained winds of 80 kilometers an hour with gusts up to 140 kilometers an hour. I can't imagine what it was like for the disciples to be caught in the midst of that storm. So we move into verse 25. And in the fourth watch of the night, he went to them, walking on the sea. Now, sometime between the hour of 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., Jesus went to the disciples. Went shows that the onus was on Jesus. It was his decision to go to them. They did not call on him. Perhaps they may have called on God, who may have sent Jesus out, but in their time of crisis, in the darkest hour, Jesus shows up walking on the water. And the storm seemed to not have any effect on him at all. Now here's the strange part, verse 26. And the disciples, having seen him walking on the sea, were troubled, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. So at first, the disciples didn't recognize him, or they truly didn't understand the scope of his abilities. In the translating of them seeing him, we can understand that they did not recognize him. When it says they saw him, they didn't actually recognize it as Jesus. They saw something. If they had seen him, they'd have yelled, "Jesus!" But they screamed, "It's a ghost!" So the disciples are troubled on so many levels, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. They were a wreck in what could have become a wreck. The sight and announcement of phantasm, that's the word, would have brought them into even further phobos, even further panic. Verse 27, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, fear not." So in making this account personal, I wondered what Jesus thought in moments like this, when he had to deal with those who knew him, who had seen what he could do, but who still didn't know him. Then I think of me. I'm a disciple, and there are times when I don't call on him, when I try to maintain control of my own boat in the midst of a storm. Jesus did for them what he still does for believers. Jesus took control of the situation. He said these words, "Take courage, it is I, fear not." Understand, in Jesus' words, there is power. Jesus wasn't suggesting that they calm down. In his words, their spirits would have obeyed, and assurance would have been restored. It would have been an immediate internal response. In verse 28, and Peter answering said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you upon the waters." Now, Peter would have had to have yelled these words at Jesus. The storm is still ongoing. When I read this account, my mind asked the question, how many other people had Peter seen walking on the water in the midst of a storm? If it is you, were ghosts a common thing in Jesus' day, that they had seen these things happen before? Again, I wonder what Jesus thought when he heard those words. Didn't Peter realize he was no longer afraid, that his spirit had relaxed? So the word that Peter used, command, also means incite. Peter wants Jesus to say something to move him into action. Now, have you ever tried to get a child to jump into water when you're standing right there? How many words did you have to use? How many proddings, how many promises to get your child, or the child, whoever it was, to jump into the water? That's what Peter is expecting. He's expecting Jesus to encourage him with many words. Jesus says, come. Don't you wish that your children were that obedient? One word and they'd obey? That'd be great. In verse 29, and Peter obeys, having descended from the boat, walked upon the water and came to Jesus. Now notice, Peter never went to Jesus. Peter responded to his call. Imagine Peter stepping out of the boat and onto the water, like a child learning to walk. Those first uneasy, hesitant steps that then become bolder and more assured with each step. I can imagine that Peter was elated, likely thinking, I'm doing it. I'm really doing it. I'm walking on water. And those in the boat must have been amazed, possibly even thinking, me next. I want to try it. I want to do it next. Well, in verse 30, we see this. And seeing the charging wind, he was afraid, and having begun to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me! I can imagine Peter's looking at Jesus. They maintained eye contact for those first few steps, maybe even exchanged a slight smile. But out of Peter's peripheral vision, he sees spray coming off the top of a wave and are reminded that there is an ongoing storm. That slight reminder caused Peter to take his eyes off of Jesus, to the point where now he glances at the wave and his concentration and his focus is broken. Jesus is no longer his focus, and the less he focused on Jesus, the more he sank. Lord, save me! Peter feared for his life, as if Jesus would have allowed him to drown. Verse 31, and immediately Jesus, having stretched out the hand, took hold of him. How far did Peter sink before he called out? Did he try to fix the problem himself? Was he trying to put his foot back on top of the water to get back on water? Trying to keep his eyes on Jesus, but at the same time, every time he did look at Jesus, he'd also look at the wave? How long would Jesus have waited if Peter hadn't called out? Well, Jesus reached out immediately to Peter and grabbed him. Peter's afraid. Even in the presence of Jesus, his trust has waned. It is not his hand that reached for Jesus. It is Jesus who reached and rescued Peter. He responded immediately to Peter's panicked cry. He didn't try to teach Peter a lesson by stressing him out, making him believe that he wouldn't save him. He didn't stand there and just look at Peter, maybe shaking his head a bit. No, that's not Jesus. But Jesus did say to Peter, "O little faith, why did you waver?" Jesus did not speak these words out of anger, but disappointment, like a parent whose child has behaved inappropriately, or a friend whose friend has forgotten the strength of their friendship. Peter had done what no other person had ever done before. Outside of Jesus, he broke the laws of nature because no one can walk on water. If only he hadn't looked away, maybe all of the disciples would have given the walk a try. Verse 32, and they, having entered into the boat, the wind ceased. Jesus likely helped Peter into the boat, and then he stepped in himself, and just like that, in a moment's, boom, the storm is over. No more wind, no more waves. the lesson's over as well. Verse 33, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. This is the bowing down type of worship. The disciples were on their knees acknowledging Jesus. They had witnessed him heal others, the blind, the lame. He even raised Jairus' daughter. But it takes this event to convince them of who he truly is. I know we know Jesus as our Savior. I know we say we know he's always there and we trust in him. But what is our first reaction when things go wrong, when trouble comes our way? I tend to be a problem solver, raised to do things for myself, raised on the mantra, if you want something done right, do it yourself. So asking for help doesn't come easy. Now, my wife will pray for help when looking for things she can't find, like her keys. On the other hand, I will turn things upside down trying to find my keys. And she will say to me, have you prayed about it? Well, of course not. My brain says God's got better things to do overseeing the operation of the world than to help me look for my keys. So my wife will pray on my behalf. Kind of like, sorry, God, you know how he can be. Well, as believers, we say God can do anything, but we limit what we're willing to ask him to do. Now, our lives are full of ups and downs, and there are so many things that can distract us from our relationship with God. We know he's there. He sees our struggles when they are still small, when our peripheral becomes aware of a problem, and we're up to our ankles. And he's ready to step in, but we're not calling out. And the next thing we know, we're glancing at the problem, and now we're up to our knees, but we're still not calling out. Sometimes we wait until we're overwhelmed. We're beside ourselves because the problem has now become so huge, we're crying out in fear and panic. And God steps in. It's not a lack of faith or trust in God. It's a lack of understanding what God is truly willing to do for us as our Father, and our willingness to ask him. How long did the disciples struggle? Did the wind start as a breeze and gain strength gradually? At no point did they call out to Jesus. Yes, he's maybe far away, but that was never something they did. What would have happened if Jesus hadn't made his presence known? What if he had just walked around on the edge of the shore? What would have happened to the disciples? Jesus must have known how windy it was. Was he waiting to see how long it would take before they called him? And when they didn't, did he go out knowing they would struggle until they perished if he didn't? It's not coincidental that the storm stopped when Jesus got in the boat. There was a bit of a testing. Jesus wants to help us. Sometimes he intervenes without us knowing, and sometimes he waits for us to ask. But how must Jesus have felt knowing that his disciples, his friends, his brothers were struggling with this storm, knowing that they knew he was capable of many things, knowing that they knew he was near-ish, waiting for them to call on him, and the call never came. How many believers do the same thing? We need to be asking Jesus to help us now in the storms that we see building in our world today, to do what can be done before it becomes catastrophic. And some of it already has. But before we can truly become overwhelmed, even if it's a matter of looking after us, after each other, after believers in the midst of this world. Let us call to him now and watch what he can do. Let us be willing to respond to his call to step out of the boat and be used. Amen. Have a great week.